Here we are in week 3. We're going to take a look at some macro policy. Now, this is admittedly a pretty quick review of macro policy. We're going to hit the highlights or the lowlights as you're, depending on your perspective on things. But these are really important issues. Typically, we look at macro as things that affect the whole economy. And obviously, if you live within an economy, if your business functions within a particular economy that's subject to these policies, you're going to feel the pinch. So what's the objective? Well, the objective of macro policy is pretty simple. Government policy is designed to try to create or sustain what we call economic stability. Economic stability has 3 parts. First of all, economies or governments want to encourage economic growth. That's changes in GDP. So if we're trying to increase output, we're trying to use policies that are going to help to increase output. That's focusing on the idea of economic growth, and we would like growth to be positive and sustained. The second thing is you want to try to control inflation. In other words, you want to make sure that price levels don't go up or even down too quickly. You want there to be a nice, either steady increase at a relatively low rate or just no change at all. That would be preferable. The third area of economic stability focuses on unemployment. This is the area, of course, where people have jobs. You want to make sure that unemployment rates don't get too high. For no other reason, that creates a lot of political instability as people wonder and are concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to put food on the table. So these are the 3 areas: growth, inflation, and unemployment. The problem that they often run into, the problem that policymakers often run into, is that while when growth goes up, unemployment usually goes down, and that's a positive thing. There also tends to be some increase in inflation. So while growth and unemployment tend to move in the direction you want them to, when growth goes up, unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. So like, oh, well, I can't have all 3 of these things at once. Or if growth is falling and unemployment is rising, those 2 things are moving in the wrong direction. But usually what happens is that inflation goes down. And so that inflation variable tends to move in the opposite direction of the other 2, at least the direction that you want it to go. And that can pose some significant problem, and that's where policymakers try to step in and smooth things over. So what are we talking about when we talk about policy? Well, there are 2 types of policy. There's fiscal policy, which is taxing and spending behavior of governments. This is the revenue collection. That's the taxing side. So whether it's taxes or whether it's fees or something like that, it's the revenue generating side of government. And then what do they do with the money once they get it? What do they spend it on? That's fiscal policy. Monetary policy deals with the money supply. And whereas fiscal policy is conducted by Congress, monetary policy is conducted by the Fed or your central bank. And the idea there is, what should we do about the supply of money? And this is important because the supply of money will affect inflation, and it might help unemployment. There's some debate about that one. So when we look at these policies, how much do they work together and which is more effective? And again, there's also some significant amount of debate about those 2 questions as well. Well, let's take a look at fiscal policy first. Again, fiscal policy is the funding of government, or part of it includes the funding of government, taxing, whatever kind of taxes they would be they income tax, property tax, sales tax, Social Security tax, certain excise taxes on particular products such as gasoline, alcohol, tobacco. What kind of taxes don't really matter. It's just that that's a way that governments can fund their spending. And there are fees, of course, and borrowing is included in this. And then what kind of spending is government going to engage in? Are they going to engage in general spending, the kind of spending that adds to GDP? So they build roads or they increase defense spending, or maybe there's a school built or you hire a police officer. Or is it transfer payments? Transfer payments are those social programs, the Medicare, the Medicaid, the welfare programs. Those are things that don't get counted as GDP because you're simply moving revenue, moving money from one group to another. There's no increase in output when you have transfer spending. Of course, you can't really talk about fiscal policy without talking about deficits and debts. And this is a big problem if you pay attention at all to politics. This is one of the areas where both sides of the aisle say that they're going to try to reduce the government debt. But in order to do that, they have to spend less or generate more revenue. A deficit occurs when you spend more than you bring in. So that might mean that you're spending too much, but it also might mean that you're bringing in too little. The flip side of that would be a budget surplus. We haven't really seen a budget surplus in the United States for some period of time. A surplus would be the opposite, where your revenues are greater than your spending. And if you're going to bring down your debt, which are years and years of accumulated deficits, then you need to at some point run a budget surplus so that you have extra money to pay down the money that you didn't have, yet you spent anyway. Well, when Congress conducts fiscal policy, obviously there's the problem that of how to balance the budget, whether they should balance the budget. But there's another more sort of fundamental problem when it comes to running deficits. It's something we call the crowding out effect. The crowding out effect occurs when we see this manifested in something called the loanable funds market. The loanable funds market is basically the market where borrowers and where savers and investors come. The supply curve is the savings. So this is when you put your money in a bank account or when you put money in a bond account. This is money that is used then by businesses to expand their business, or any kind of investor. And the demand side is the investment side. So when Congress spends money it doesn't have, it needs to go and borrow it in the loanable funds market. In other words, when Congress runs budget deficits, they increase the demand for loanable funds. And what that does, just like in any other market, when the demand increases, then what happens is that the interest rate rises, or the price rises in this case. So we see here the price going up as a result of that increase in demand, and the interest rate is the price that you pay to borrow money. Well, the government's going to borrow money one way or another. Usually they don't worry so much about the interest rate, but the private investor does worry about the interest rate. And if the interest rate goes up, then that means that the cost of borrowing money rises, and when the cost increases, people do less of that activity. Now, the quantity is increasing in this market, the equilibrium quantity, and that's okay to an extent. So we're about right here, and then we move out to here. But that increase in quantity comes from government, not from the private sector. So government's borrowing more money, but the private sector borrows less money because the interest rate rises. Now, if we borrow less money as businesses, that means that businesses don't expand as quickly. That means they're not going to hire as many people. That means down the road they're not going to be able to meet any kind of increase in demand for their product because they haven't invested in the present. And that's called the crowding out effect of government borrowing. It's a problem because if we want investment to take place, and we do want investment to take place, then when government borrows money, it makes it more costly for that activity, and consequently we get less of it. There's also problems for government behavior, or for fiscal policy, when we look at just the timing of everything. Typically what happens is policy is made in reaction to some event. That's just normal, and that's fine. We can sort of understand that. Let's take a look here for just for a second at a business cycle. So a business cycle has this sort of up and down movement to it. Business cycles go up, business cycles go down. And we see that those different parts of the business cycle have different names. When for example, right here, when the business cycle is on its way up, we call that a recovery. At the top, we call this the peak. On the way down, we call this the recession. And when it bottoms out, and starts to head back up again, we call this area here the trough. Well, policy is written in response to where you are in the business cycle. And what's going on as these ups and downs occur in the business cycle is that time moves on. So if you realize you're in a recession, so once again, if you realize you're somewhere in this area right here, where that X is, if you realize you're in that recession area, say, well, we've got to do something about this. And so you've recognized the problem exists. Well, look where you are at that time. Here's where the recession starts, up at this line right here, where that arrow is pointing to the red line. So the recession has already started, and you don't realize you're in the recession till you're in the recession. And you want to do something about that. Now you have to get some legislation passed through Congress. That's called the legislative lag, because that takes some time. People in Congress don't always agree with each other. They don't always agree with what should be done. They don't agree with whether there should be tax cuts or government spending increases or something to increase the health of the economy. So that takes a little bit of time. And then maybe you realize that you have this, once you've realized there's a problem, you're at the red X. Once you get the legislation passed to fix the problem, maybe you're here at the green X. So again, time's going on. Time sort of goes along here along this blue line. So this is time marching on. And so you've realized there's a problem at the red X. You've passed some legislation to fix the problem, and then it takes a little bit of time for that legislation to go into effect. And so perhaps that legislation goes into effect right about here at the yellow X. The problem with that, from the economy's perspective, is that at that yellow X, at that point in time, your economy is starting to increase again. And so now you've passed policy to deal with a recession that you're no longer in. That's what I mean by timing issues. Fiscal policy doesn't happen immediately, and that's a problem for fiscal policy. Of course, there are other problems as well, politics being primary among those, because people sort of have they don't have a real good sense that what they're doing is impactful. I mean, they think it's impactful, but they don't really realize the full impact of it. They're much more short-term oriented. They're worried about the next election cycle, and so they don't think long-term. And there's very little political will to do anything to jeopardize their own politicians' own job status or employment status. And that's just natural. There's very self-interested individuals. That's not a critique, it's just reality. And when you have self-interested individuals watching out for their own interests, they oftentimes don't look down the road to see how this is going to affect other people. So let's just spend here a minute on taxes. When we talk about taxes, there are different kinds of taxes, obviously. But from an economic perspective, some of the things that we're most interested in are things called marginal tax rates. This is the additional percentage of your income that is taken in the form of a tax. So as you make one more dollar, what percentage of that dollar is taken in taxes? The way the United States federal income tax system is set up, we have what's called a progressive tax. A progressive tax means that as you make more money, a greater percentage of your income is taken, meaning that the marginal tax rates increase as you make more. So if you are in the highest tax bracket, you're going to pay 35% or 35 cents of every additional dollar that you make. If you're in the lowest tax bracket, that's only 10%. Not all taxes, however, are progressive. Some taxes are regressive. A regressive tax is a tax where as you make more, you pay a smaller percentage of your income in tax. And an example of this would be the Social Security tax. Up to about $100,000, give or take, people pay the same percentage of their income for Social Security tax. Beyond that, your additional tax or your marginal tax rate is zero. So for someone who makes a lot of money, so Bill Gates or a professional athlete, something like that, they pay Social Security tax only on a very small percentage of their income. And so their overall percentage that's taken from them in terms of Social Security tax is actually quite a bit smaller than you or I. That's a regressive tax. The more you make, the smaller your percentage that's taken. Finally, there's something called the proportional tax. A proportional tax is simply a tax where no matter how much you make, you pay the same percentage. This would be the idea of a flat tax, where everybody pays the same percentage of your income in taxes, or a sales tax, where regardless of how much you make, everybody pays the same percentage in sales tax if you have sales tax in the state where you live. So these are different kinds of taxes, and they all deal with the marginal tax rate, the additional amount of tax that you pay when you, whatever percentage of your income that you pay as far as your taxes, and how much more do you pay, or how much less do you pay as you make more money. Now, tax rates are very important for government. Obviously, the tax rate tells you what percentage of something you are taking, whether it's the percentage of a sale or percentage of someone's income. But Arthur Laffer created this, what's called the Laffer curve. And it illustrates the relationship between tax rates and government revenue. This is important for the government because, obviously, if your tax rate goes up too high, you might encourage people to not pay their taxes or simply to not work. For example, the tax rates that we have along here travel from 0 on one end up to 100% on the other end. Think about this. If the tax rate is 0, the government revenue is going to be 0 because there's effectively no tax. As government increases the tax rate, that's going to increase the amount of revenue that they collect, and we see that as we move up the curve. But at some point up here, that government revenue is going to max out, because beyond that tax rate, T star, people are going to either stop working or start hiding their income. If the tax rate, for example, is say 99%, that means that for every dollar you make, you get to keep a penny. And the question becomes, is it worth it for you to work? What about at 98%? What about at 90%? What about 80%? Where is the tax rate that's going to create for you the incentive to stop earning money or stop reporting your income? That's what T star is. So at T star, we've effectively generated as much revenue as we can from taxation, and if we go beyond that, taxes are higher than is optimal. So people will often say, well, if we cut tax rates, that's going to lead to less revenue for the government because people are paying a smaller percentage of their income. And that may be correct, but it may not be correct. According to the Laffer curve, if we have a tax rate right now that's too high, by cutting the tax rate, we may actually generate more revenue. That's what the Laffer curve is. Now, the question is, what is T star? And no one's really pinned that down yet. But it's a really interesting theory, and Laffer has gained quite a bit of notoriety as a result of this Laffer curve. Now, let's move on to the other area of policy, the monetary policy. Monetary policy is conducted by the Fed in the United States, or the Federal Reserve Bank. This is these are the policies that the bank engages in to either increase or decrease the money supply. And there's a couple of issues that we want to pay attention to. One is, should the Fed be doing this? And if they are going to do it, what should be their target? Should it be inflation? Should they try to control the money supply so that prices don't go up or down too much? And secondly, should they worry about unemployment? Because if unemployment and inflation are linked, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, then perhaps the goal of the Fed should be to try to reduce unemployment. Now, there's a lot of people who say that's beyond the scope of why the Fed was created, but that's one of the questions the Fed needs to answer. Issue number 2 deals with how low is too low for interest rates. The Fed changes the money supply primarily to affect borrowing costs, to try to encourage people to borrow and spend. Right now, we see that interest rates are really, really low. And the question is, how low can they go? We've seen this problem in places like Japan, where the monetary policy gets to a point where it's simply no longer effective if you can't lower interest rates, because 0 is sort of the bottom floor for interest rates. Issue number 3 is, what is the Fed doing? There's talk about quantitative easing, or QE. There's QE1, QE2, and there's a question about whether QE3 is on the table. So what are they doing? What is the purpose of the Fed? Have they gone beyond anything that's effective, and do they really know what they're doing? Well, when the Fed operates, when the Fed controls the money supply, they have 3 primary tools. One is called the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio tells us the percentage of a bank's deposit that it must hold. In other words, when you put money in a bank, let's say you put $100 in a bank account, the bank has to keep part of that money, 10%, in reserves. They're not allowed to lend it, but they can do whatever they want with the other $90. The reserve ratio tells the banks, your local bank, how much of a deposit it has to hold, and the Fed can change that. If it increases the reserve ratio, it means that a local bank must hold a bigger percentage of a deposit, which means they have less to lend. If they lower the reserve ratio, the bank can lend more because they don't have to hold as much in reserve. Now, the reserve ratio is a pretty sticky issue simply because it can be very destabilizing to the banking industry. So the Fed doesn't typically mess with the reserve ratio, although they have the option to do that. Second thing the Fed can do is that they can lower what's called the discount rate. The discount rate is the rate at which a bank borrows money from the Fed. Now, the bank may need to borrow money from the Fed for a variety of reasons. It's having trouble meeting their reserve ratio, and that's the primary reason a bank would borrow from the Fed. But they are not allowed to do that for free. They have to pay the Fed an interest rate. And if the interest rate is sufficiently high, then banks will not want to borrow money from the Fed, and consequently, they will make sure that they have enough in reserve, just in case. But if the discount rate is low, the banks will be willing to lend, and if they miss their reserve ratio, they borrow from the Fed at a low discount rate, and that's not such a bad thing for them. So lower discount rates tend to increase lending, and higher discount rates discourage lending. The discount rate can change, and it changes periodically, but it can change only about every 6 weeks. Where the Fed typically operates when it comes to monetary policy is what's called open market operations. Open market operations is when the Fed goes out into the open market and buys and sells typically government securities or bonds. When the Fed buys a bond, it in essence takes money that it has created and gives it to the bond holder, and then or a bank, and the bank gives the Fed the bond. So when you buy bonds, when the Fed buys bonds, it increases the money supply by injecting money directly into the economy. When they sell bonds, what they're doing is they're holding a bond, selling those bonds to a person or some entity who gives the Fed money. When the Fed gets a hold of the money's no longer in circulation. In other words, it can't be spent or lent, and so the money supply decreases. So these are the tools of the Fed. They can either raise or lower the reserve ratio, raise or lower the discount rate, or they can buy and sell bonds in the open market. Open market operations can happen very, very frequently. In fact, they happen typically every week, and they happen so regularly that we hardly ever pay attention to them. Those are the tools of the Fed. Now, I mentioned the idea of a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. This inflation-unemployment trade-off is referred to as the Phillips curve, named after the guy who created the curve or who realized this relationship. The Phillips curve says that there's an inverse relationship between the inflation rate, and that's what we see on this side of the graph, and the unemployment rate, which we see down here. The inflation rate should be higher when unemployment is lower, and that's what we see on the graph at this red X. We have a high inflation rate, about 5%, but a really nice and low unemployment rate down here, just a little over 3. When the inflation rate drops down here, so we have a very low inflation rate, about 0.5%, but that corresponds to a much higher unemployment rate, which is over 6%. Now, what Phillips noticed was that in the decade of the 1960s, there was a pretty stable and pretty obvious relationship between those two variables. The dates that are shown here, so this is 61, this is 1961, 1962, 1963, and so on up to 1969. So what Phillips did was he plotted inflation against unemployment for each one of these years, and he noticed that there's a nice downward sloping line that to him illustrated this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And it looks really neat. And what that should suggest is that if the Fed or your central bank is controlling the money supply, that affects inflation. If there's more money in circulation, the prices are going to be higher. But if the Fed can control the money supply and hence inflation, then they can also impact unemployment. And so if you want lower unemployment, you need to create some inflation by printing money and injecting it into the economy. If you want lower inflation, the consequence would be higher unemployment. And so all the Fed has to do is balance its interests between unemployment and inflation. And so this Phillips curve analysis comes on the scene, and people say, oh, wow, there's this great new role for the central bank. However, if you look at the relationship between inflation and unemployment beyond the 1960s, and you can sort of see the 60s curve right in here. We have that downward sloping curve, that's sort of what this blue line is showing. Other than the 60s, that relationship doesn't really hold all that well. I mean, you can see some of the 70s. We have 1975, 76, 77, 78, 79. Here's 74. It's almost like a rhomboid or something like that. This weird sort of geometric shape that doesn't really have any specific downward slope. I mean, we have 79, 78, 77, 76. There's the direction, but then 75 jumps up, and 74 is way over by 79. It's just a mess. And so there's been a lot of effort that has gone into trying to explain this oddity, this odd shape of the Phillips curve, and whether or not it is actually something that really can happen, something that can really show this relationship. But the Fed and most central banks do act as if they have this trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and in so doing, they may be making matters a little bit complicated. So that's part of what the Fed does. What about interest rates? Right now, interest rates are very, very low. And the question is, can the Fed lower those interest rates anymore? In order to lower the interest rates, the Fed needs to increase the money supply. But there's a point at which you would find that the interest rate simply won't go any lower. Banks won't lend at a 0% interest rate. And you can't charge a negative interest rate, which basically would mean that you are being given money to borrow. So how low can the interest rates go and still have effective monetary policy? That's a huge and very significant question that nobody's really come up with the answer for. Japan has had interest rates at or near zero for decades, and their economy is still quite stagnant. In fact, there's this period of time in Japan that's referred to as the lost decade, where there's been absolutely no growth at all in the economy, and the question is, what, if anything, can monetary policy accomplish? And that gets us to our last slide. Quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is a significant Federal Reserve push into the market to increase the money supply and reduce interest rates. So what are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to increase the money supply. They buy bonds and other assets, and that's just the difference between quantitative easing and other types of monetary policy. They're buying lots and lots of assets, bonds, in some cases corporate bonds. They're trying to make sure that firms have money. They want to reduce interest rates. They want to encourage borrowing at those lower interest rates, but they also want to increase consumption and investment. In GDP terms, GDP is equal to consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. That's what that little equation is there. C is consumption, I is investment, G is government spending, and X is net exports. What the Fed wants to do by increasing the amount of currency in circulation is they really want to increase this letter right here. They want to increase investment, and they also want people to borrow money and then consequently spend it. So they're trying to increase consumption as well. The problem with QE and the problem with any kind of monetary policy is that while the Fed may want to do something, it's incumbent upon the citizens of a country to respond to what the Fed does. If we don't spend money as a group of people, even if it's very cheap to borrow that money, then what the Fed wants to happen won't happen. So, in essence, the success or failure of the Fed is in large part determined upon whether the people will go along with what the Fed wants to have happen. And that's a huge question, as people are worried about the financial health, not only the country's financial health, but their own financial health. They may forego borrowing even at really, really low interest rates, and consequently that increase in consumption that the Fed would like to see happen won't happen. Well, again, that was a very quick run-through of some macroeconomic policy issues, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. There's lots more that can be said about this. There are, in fact, entire classes on public finance that can be undertaken. But this gives us an idea as to what we're talking about at the macro level. Next week, we're going to move on and take a look at how some of these policies can directly impact the behavior of business.